Welcome back to From the Belly. This is Doug Wheeler. This is my podcast. And I guess I've been known to say I'm really proud of it. And I'm really happy with the lineup of guests that we've had. And this week, we have Dr. Nick Peterson from Indianapolis, Indiana. He and I talked not too long ago, and I tried to describe to him where I used to live in Indy, and I didn't do a good job. But I've got very fond memories of that city. I come from Chicago originally. All my people are from there. Moved to Kentucky when I was young. But Indianapolis was never far from home, man. We could be there in 2 hours, just drive north. And it gets cold there, man. It gets cold. Doesn't it, Nick? It gets cold there, man. You get that Great Lake stuff coming down. Yeah, Nick did a thumbs up as if he likes that, and that's cool. So I'm going to say a few things about Dr. Nick Peterson. As I've said in every episode, I used to read somebody's lengthy resume, and sometimes I look at the screen, and the guest would look maybe uncomfortable / bored. Like, okay, all those things, that's great. It's kind of like reading PowerPoint. So I let people tell me and the audience who they are, but I do have a few things to say about Nick. I do want to say that when Nick sent me an email recently with some thoughts about what we're going to talk about today, he signed off this way. God gives you today, let your joy rekindle and gladness. It cut me off there. Do you remember what it says? And gladness, Nick?
And gladness arrest you.
Arrest you. And the day I read that, I needed to hear that. I really needed to hear that. So I don't know if you sign off all your emails that way. Maybe I'd want to be special and you tell me, no, Doug, that was just meant for you. But it was special, man. So I want to thank you for that. All right. Whether in the pulpit, the classroom, or the studio, Nick pursues a singular vision, cultivating practices and modes of inquiry that reveal God's unfailing commitment to Black thriving and flourishing. Based in Indiana, he preaches and teaches across the country, developing work that honors both the theoretical sophistication of contemporary Black critical thought and the lived spiritual realities of Black communities. I sussed that out of a long bio, but I thought that kind of got right to it. Before we jump into some of the questions, Nick, anything you want to say about that opening, about what you're about? Does that kind of capsulize?
It does. I am a child, an adolescent, a young adult, and a full adult of Black faith and Black faith context. And so as my vocation and my life has come to include presence in academic and intellectual spaces, I've maintained these primary commitments, right, to the context that have raised me and questions that can hopefully help these contexts to thrive in generations to come. So yes, I think that's a good encapsulation of what I'm trying to do.
Tell us about this raising that you referenced. Let's talk about the raising of Nick Peterson. What's the history?
Yeah, so I was born in St. Louis, I guess second generation born in St. Louis, as is the case for many Black folk in the Midwest, Northern Midwest. So the St. Louis's, the Detroits, the Chicagos. My grandparents, both maternal and paternal, are from deep Black Belt South. My paternal grandfather was born and raised in Lowndes County, Alabama. My paternal grandmother came out of Denmark and Jackson, Tennessee. My maternal grandmother came out of Clarksdale, Arkansas. My maternal grandfather came out of Mississippi. And all made their way to St. Louis for better work and to come out of the rural, agrarian South to take industrial jobs in St. Louis. So both of my parents were born and raised in St. Louis. I literally grew up around the corner from my grandmother, my mom's mom, and we were in a family church. Both sides of my family were in the same church. My parents were sort of the kind of church arranged marriage. Oh, look at those two. Aren't they cute? When y'all gonna get married type of situation. And so my earliest memories are of prayer meetings and youth groups and Bible studies and choir rehearsals and all of those things. So both sides of my family were heavily involved in our local church. I grew up in a Pentecostal church, so it was a great place to experience embodiment, right? So I was the kind of church kid where, for me and my cousins, our fun was playing church. So we go to church, be in church all day, and then we come home and we play church in the basement.
Wow.
So much of my imagination, much of my sense of comfort, as the theorist Merleau-Ponty would talk about it. What's at hand for me are all of these aesthetic practices, all of the sort of theological brilliance, or what Mother Ruby Sales would call spiritual genius of these environments, has been with me and shaped me for quite some time.
Was there ever a time growing up in the church that you not just in any given time you were there, but a season of your adolescent life, or maybe even post-adolescence, that you didn't want to be there any longer?
Yes, so in a lot of our Black church context, we have this language that we use about a call, right,
Mm.
and a call to ministry. More specifically, people talk about a call to preach. And I didn't necessarily have a call to preach, but at 14, I had this call to go to school. And it came while I was at a youth summer retreat. And I shared with one of the youth leaders who was there with us that I heard this voice saying, it's time to go to school. And I wasn't sure what that meant or what to do with it. We were in the summer, so I was like, well, school's not going to start
Yeah,
until
right.
another
And
couple
you're
of
going
months.
into what, like the ninth grade or something, or what?
Right. So this is like, okay. So like, okay, well, maybe it's the Spirit telling me to take high school seriously and stop playing how I was in middle school. And so the youth worker was like, yeah, like, this is a transition time, and maybe you'll just have to take, witnessing and other these pieces more seriously. And then we got back to church that Sunday. And while we were in service, Dr. Rachel Webb, who led our churches, but also just kind of across the denomination, the Bible Institute, which was the training organ for clergy within the denomination. And she got up and she said, it's time to go to school. And it was the inflection that I had heard during that prayer time earlier in the week
Wow.
while we were at this youth retreat. And so instantly my eyes dart over to the youth worker, and the youth worker is like, smiling and wide eyed. And so afterwards, I talked with the youth worker and tell her, like, this is what I heard. And so she spoke with my mom, and this context, let everything be established by the mouth of 2 and 3 witnesses. So she shared,
Oh, okay.
this is, what he came to me and said. And so my mom reached out to Dr. Webb, and Dr. Webb was willing to meet with us. And so I met with Dr. Webb, and Dr. Webb did the sort of, is it Gamaliel, who's in Acts, where they're trying to figure out what to do with the early church. And he's like, well, if they say it's of God, we can't stop what God is going to do. And if it's not of God, it's not going to succeed. So let's just see how this plays out. Mm-hmm. And so Dr. Webb went with that kind of option. And I was not qualified to enter. I didn't have a high school. I didn't even start at high school. I didn't have a GED. But Dr. Webb agreed to let me audit all of the courses.
In seminary?
So, yes. So in this Bible Institute. So I would go to school during the day. And then in the evening, I would take these classes at the Institute. And so I did that all throughout high school. By my sophomore year, I started getting preaching engagements. And so I'd be preaching, at the churches in our connection and those pieces. But by the time I became a senior, I felt trapped. I felt like I was a 50-year-old in an 18-year-old sort of body. And so my sense of leaving, when it came time to look for colleges, I tried to get as far away from St. Louis as possible. So I went from St. Louis to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I did my undergrad work. Visited a couple of Pentecostal and sanctified churches, and were like, the flavor on the East Coast was very different than the flavor in the Midwest. There were some congregations that separated men and women by gender, did not allow women to preach and to speak.
And that wasn't true of what you had grown up with.
That wasn't true at all with what I'd grown up in. So I was like, yeah, this is not it. And I'm also a musician. So much of how I supported myself in high school, but also definitely in college, was as a musician playing piano and organ. And so I started playing for this African Methodist Episcopal Church in the city, and then eventually became minister of music there. Never really mentioned to the pastor about this earlier, experience that I had. Right. And then one Sunday, the pastor looks over and I'm at the organ, and he's like, Nick, it's time for you to stop hiding behind the music. Right. God has so much more for you. And then that sort of, fast forward, that eventually means I land in seminary. And after seminary, I go on to do doctoral work. I'm still grounded in wrestling with these faith questions. So I did not necessarily leave, quote unquote, the church, but I left what I understood as sort of like this need to be a certain kind of wonder kid in order to figure out my own voice in those pieces.
So let's say the 19-year-old Nick, what was a question that you were wrestling with, or a series of questions that you were wrestling with then? that maybe you don't wrestle with any longer, or maybe you still wrestle with?
That's a good question. I think one of the questions, particularly growing up in a Black fundamentalist tradition, and especially one as particular, right? So I wasn't just raised Pentecostal, I was raised apostolic Pentecostal.
Well, and you use the word Pentecostal sanctified when you're
Yes.
describing, and I was curious, what does that mean?
Right. So the sanctified movement is more closely aligned with the Wesleyan holiness movement, right? So it takes this notion of sanctification as not just the process of one's maturation in faith, but as the work of salvation, right? So to have confessed, to have been baptized, to have received the indwelling of the Holy Spirit is now not just becoming sanctified, it's a commitment to live a sanctified lifestyle. And so in the sanctified, the 20th century sanctified church, that meant, you don't necessarily go to movies and dances, and you don't drink, you don't smoke.
You
The women wear
separate,
dresses.
if you will, from the world.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. And then in the apostolic tradition, that takes even a more controversial position in its denial of the Trinity. And so the apostolic faith holds a very high Christology, really born out of Colossians and some of Paul's other writings, particularly the high Christology, where the fullness of God is manifested in the person of Jesus Christ. And so the one Lord, the one faith, the one baptism is all, manifested in Jesus. So there's a heterodoxy to that, but alongside the heterodoxy is that a sort of undercurrent that the Trinitarians are wrong.
Right.
That they ain't got it all, right? So some of what I was wrestling with at 19 was being in this Trinitarian Methodist church and recognizing that the Spirit is at work here. Right, that the Spirit is moving through the preaching and through the singing in the same way that I had recognized the Spirit moving in my home context. But these people did not believe how I believed. And they prayed prayers that I had not prayed. And so that was sort of like my first real foray into this notion that God was bigger than the tradition that I had inherited, and even the tradition that I learned how to lead in. And that's just been an ongoing realization, right? The concentric circles that constantly spiral out, where God's presence is not limited by these things that have been so instrumental to my own experience and understanding of God.
So those transform.
Yeah, the circle
traditions.
Widens. Yeah.
But they're necessary, Nick. The traditions are necessary, or they're part of the human experience, if you will, of church.
Yeah, I think what the traditions will do, and often do, is that they frame, and they can frame by virtue of establishing order, and that order that's established does important work at discerning and making differentiation, right? It's really what we're trying to do with language, right? It's by language that we narrate what makes an iris different from a rose, right? It's by narration that we describe how a trumpet sounds different from a flute. And I think tradition in that way of language is trying to help us differentiate how we understand God at work in these practices that we've inherited and that we learn how to make meaning from. But as is the case with most things, it can be used in ways that are no longer expansive, but then in ways that are damaging and narrowing,
yeah.
And fraught with violence.
Where do you line up now in regards to the apostolic faith and the Trinitarian view? And because you're currently a pastor.
Yes, I'm a pastor. Sorry, I'm ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Okay.
Oddly enough, within Black Christianity as a collective group, and obviously there's all kinds of diversities, but within Black ecumenism, and I think Black faith in the Black Christian faith in the Atlantic world tends to be highly Christological in general. People sing about Jesus, they worship Jesus, they call on Jesus, they pray to Jesus. So the centering of a high Christology is not really predicated on the formalities of Trinitarian formulation. I would say alongside that, the extent to which some of the theological concerns that emerged earlier in the church's history are not the pressing theological concerns for Black religious folk across these particular traditions. Now, the reason why it mattered in my apostolic childhood was that the other folk wasn't saved unless you.
Okay, yeah. But then you realize, wait a second now, the Spirit of God is working in both these communities. So
in that regard, it was like, oh wait, nobody got the monopoly on this,
yeah,
right?
got you.
You have the witness that you can share and those pieces. So in many regards, it's my question is a very different question than the question of which is the proper orthodoxy, or what are the specific ways in which we can encounter God in the divine, and what does that then mean for the practices that we herald as the practices of the church. That's much less my question, and really my questions have centered around what is this faith mean for Black people in our present moment and in our history.
Would you attempt to answer that question?
Yeah, the shortcut, and this is something that I'm wrestling with even as someone who engages the biblical text, that faith is a technology. And by technology, I mean it is something that we fashion, right? It's material that we have to create for the sake of making sense of our experiences and recognizing that our experiences are just not what happens in our own bodies, but they are somehow embedded with creation, embedded with these, existential realities that we can't fully name, right? That are present but also intangible.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that's like, did you feel that, right? Did you sense that there are these intuitions, these inclinings, these hunches that we are trying to wrestle with? And the technology of faith, the technology of religious practice helps us to do that. And what I find interesting about our present moment is we value the work that other communities have done to an extent, because we actually don't want to engage in that work in our present.
Oh, can you give an example of that, Nick?
The challenge with tradition, and I say this as someone who teaches, right, probably two of the most traditional practices of the church, preaching and worship.
That's kind of church, isn't
it? That what we've done is that we almost conclude that they did the work, and our task is to just maintain the work that they did, right? That the biblical text, the canon that we've inherited, is what God has said, and we just have to keep mining it to make it relevant to our present moment. And what that means is that we abdicate the real risk of faith, which the real risk of faith is to be uncertain in every possible way that God said what God said, or what you claim God said, that God will do what you claim God said God would do, and that God is with you in the midst of it, right? So when the Hebrew writer writes about this great cloud of witnesses who all lived toward a faith and never saw it realized, right? To our knowledge, Abram had two children, one that he abandoned and another that he was willing to kill because of what he believed God was saying to him, but never lived to see the children in the Goshen Valley, or to see the children cross over Jordan into a promised land, or see Solomon build a temple. None of those things were accessible to him. So whatever commitments Abraham and Abram into Abraham lived out were never realized for his own eyes. My sense is that the narrowness of our faith and what that means for what we practice is that we think that those questions are resolved, and that our task is just to mine them for joy, to mine them for wisdom in the present moment, and not recognize that the same faith work calls us now. I'll give a more concrete example.
Great.
I would make a case that for many, particularly Christians in North America, that we have more faith in the promise of the Constitution than we have in the promise of the various intonations of God in the Bible. That we really do believe that there is something distinctly special about the United States of America, distinctly special about our history, distinctly special about its brand of democracy, and its narratives of inclusion, of exceptionalism, of possibility, of desirability, of good life.
It's the blueprint. It's the blueprint for us.
It's the blueprint. And we are willing to conscript our sons and our daughters to fight its wars.
Wow.
We are willing to think of our Christian faith as most readily articulated in a successful version of America, right? And that's either a liberal Christian nationalism or a conservative Christian nationalism. But in either case, a Christian nationalism, that the heart of our faith is to ensure the success of this national and this statecraft project. And so our faith is really for America becoming. Our prophetic energies are directed towards calling America to live up to her best ideals. This is a Kingsian, right, sort of prophetic vision. America has written the Negro a bad check, and all we're doing is calling for America to uphold her promises. This is also even now around our expectations that the country should be providing for the least, providing for and providing care. It's really because we believe that the country has capacity to be what it has never been. And that's a faith move because we constantly invest and reinvest in its liturgies. We constantly figure out how to preach its gospel and how to make its gospel still something that we grab hold of. Warren, Professor Calvin Warren, who's out of Emory's African American Studies program, and some of the work that he's done with Agamben and others, he has this wonderful little essay, The Politics of Hope. And in it, he sort of talks about the way the spiritual concept of hope is evacuated of its spiritual meaning to become a tool for a political process. And he reads this through, particularly through Obama's first campaign and what it meant for Obama to sort of, campaign on this promise of hope and for it to really not have the spiritual heft from which it arises. And I think that an example then of our faith would be to reduce the real conflicts, the real challenges that are present in Scripture around the possibility of a nation, the possibility of a state, the possibility of empire for and in the name of God, and what it means for that to be a successful undertaking. And we don't wrestle with that in the way that we think of the possibility of an America. And so everybody is fighting for a vision of America as if this is the ultimate covenant that God has made with humanity, is to ensure that we, are a new Jerusalem.
Well, there's a lot there, Nick. A lot there. I am now reminded of the questions that we have. And maybe this fits really well with what you just presented. Tell me if this gets at it, or even another question that I have. I'll let you choose what syncs up with what you just said. I'm thinking of something as simple as, America the Beautiful. It's just like that's the tagline, as if she's already beautiful and somehow we just need to recover her. And I think I'm hearing you say she's never really been beautiful. Maybe she's had characteristics of that. But I'm also hearing the collusion of Christian belief and whatever in service of America the Beautiful. That might be too simplistic in what I'm hearing you say, or at least what I'm taking. Is theology useful in this present moment, or do we need something else to help us navigate our present? I think you've done a really sweet job of saying, and I know you could say more, about this is our present situation. Is theology useful in this present moment, or do we need something else to help us navigate this?
So a couple of things. One is in the America the Beautiful, what I would want to interrogate with that is our fascination with beauty. Where I think that falls apart is beauty is always complicated. And beauty is always in flux and in process. If you only catch the thorns of a rose bush, your experience of the rose bush is beautiful is very different than someone whose experience of the rose has been with a thornless set of stems and only the flower. If you catch the rose bush in winter, right, after it's been pruned back to the ground, then your experience of its beauty is not predicated on its fragrance. If you catch the rose before it opens, right, you have a sense of its beauty just from its shape or what have you.
Or memory.
Right, or memory to know what becomes possible with it. That's a different experience than if you're allergic to roses. And it's like the only time I want to see a rose is when it's closed. I don't want the pollen and I don't want the fragrance. So beauty, and this is thinking alongside Cone, even beauty itself is already determining or already a byproduct of social location and experience. It already has to be contextualized. And so the beauty of America is always fraught by one's experience of the context, right? And that even goes with the naming. Who gets to decide that it's America, right? Who gets to decide that it's amber waves of grain are its own and not invasive species. Any number of those things. So in some regards, I think that question is still a power question. Now, what that then means for theology is it's all. I mean, this is right. Of course, the theologian is going to say it's all theology. What I'm suggesting is that our theology is the gospel of America that is then able to use the technologies of religion to support its gospel. So our interpretation of scripture, our interpretation of the prophetic, our understanding of communitarianism, our understanding of fidelity, all of those things are secondary to our vision of a beautiful America. And the function then of our religious practice is to help America to become beautiful. What I'm interested in theologically is a kind of theology that leaves us with no other option than something other than this. Now, as best as I can surmise at this point, the development of an apocalyptic imagination, right, which is what we see in the late stages of the Hebrew Bible, and certainly the guiding principle for the New Testament, right, is an apocalyptic vision that holds whatever God is doing is in fundamental contradistinction to the age that we are in.
Wow.
And the tensions that one can read in Jesus' ministry is how do we live into something wholly other than what we've been given?
Yeah.
And at best, in its best versions, this is sort of like the turning of the upside down, right? So the last become first, the first become the reversals, right? The reversals that characterize a number of the moves that we see in the Gospels. It becomes the kind of sharing of material wealth that characterizes the early church, and the way that the Spirit is moving ahead of the church's own imagination of what it could become. Right? So this is the vision of Peter, where he's asleep on the roof, undrunk,
right,
and he sees all of these liturgically, traditionally unclean animals coming down the sheet. And it's like, "Eat, Peter, eat." And Peter's like, "Oh no!" And then the Spirit says, "How dare you call unclean what I've made clean?" And then Peter has to leave. He goes to Cornelius' house and encounters devout people who have not had the set of experiences that he's had. And then they get assimilated through a shared experience into this community. So the Spirit is sort of moving beyond these boundaries that they've understood. But their primary question at the opening of the book is now the time that we get to get our swords and become a nation again, right? Is now the time that you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel, that we get to be a state like the other states, that we get to be an empire like the other empires, that we get to be recognized, respected, receive our honor in the ways that especially God's chosen people are to receive honor. But all of that then becomes predicated on something that is beyond their control. Jesus says to them, "It is not for you to know the times nor the seasons that God has placed in God's own hand."
So it's always elusive then. Is that?
It's always, which for me is where faith and a theology, a robust theology that points to what remains elusive, is helpful in these present moments, but it is also extremely dangerous, as faith always is.
Dangerous.
And this is...
Say more about that.
Yeah, the danger lies in, I don't know that our version in this modern, late modern, postmodern, early postmodern, late postmodern, whatever relationship we have to modernity is really situated to reckon with existential futility, meaninglessness, because our other technologies, right, our scientism, our society making has convinced us that if we can perfect these crafts, that we will have the good life.
Yeah.
And
they buoy us up, don't they? Yeah.
And we have failed to figure out how to effectively metabolize that failure. And so we constantly have to have stories that justify the disparities we continue to see in our world.
So Nick, what does this look like? And this might be too truncated of a question. What does this look like on a given, we talk about church as Sunday, and I know it's more than that. But if we talk about just the meeting place, the location, people go to church, what does this look like in the church context?
It can look like a number of things. I mean, I think in my context, it looks like a place where people could come and not feel bound to a gaze, where the women could dance, where the men could sing, where the children could play, where people could shout where the Spirit could show up and people could speak in tongues that were not their own. It meant fried chicken after church. It meant prayer meetings,
Now,
multiple.
excuse me, when you say it meant, you're referring to history. Are you saying it still means that?
It can. I mean, I think that we have some very different realities of what congregation means now, post COVID in particular, but also transitioning in general into realities of the 21st century with the onslaught of technology, right? In the same way that radio, oh my gosh, if people hear church on radio, they're never going to come into a building. And then if they see it on television, that they're never going to come into a building, and now I'm in 7 different churches on any given Sunday because of streaming. And so I can start on the East Coast and catch 2 services at 8 o'clock and at 9 o'clock on the East Coast. And then I can come into the Midwest and catch 2 services. And then I can come into the Mountain Time and catch 2 services and then catch a service on the West Coast, all before 3 o'clock, right? So I think that those present realities require, right, some tending to in many respects. But what I am suggesting in terms of the practices is that the practices were nourishing by virtue of the congregation and congregations figuring out how to do life together in ways that they found meaningful. Now, what I would say is distinct or maybe can be differentiated about that, or again, where these things are complicated. What did it mean that only the men get to speak? Or what did it mean that the prohibitions on what should be worn or could and could not be worn were primarily oriented towards women? Or that the women were expected to manage the eating and the meals that we would share before and after, right? There are ways even within these structures that we can interrogate the dynamics of power, right, that were at work. But what I tried to intone in that recapture were some of the things that were present in these early iterations of church, right? That people were just finding ways to care for each other. Now, finding ways to care for each other is a very different orientation than finding ways to be powerful. So what does it mean when that part of what's germane to your religious formation is that you will sit next to the town banker and during coffee hour, you'll be able to have a short conversation about a financial move that you're trying to make. And you'll then be able to move into some other context to bring that into reality, right? What did it mean that here in Indiana, particularly, 100 years ago during the height of the Klan was able to spread in Indiana through Sunday morning gatherings where members of the Klan would come and they would bring an offering to a church to say, hey, we want to support you. We believe in what you're doing in the community as a means of endorsement. As ministers joined the Klan, the church became a site with which to, sort of support the vision of the world that the Klan offered, which was in their mind not inconsistent with their Christian vision.
So are you saying those nefarious practices are still going on within church and that we need to be very vigilant about what is the form now of who's showing up to buy the rights, be it the Klan? Somebody would say, well, that doesn't happen in our church. I mean, we're far beyond that. I mean, women are ordained and women preach in our context. So it sounds to me like you're saying right when you think you have it settled, right when you think you've got it settled and you've got the form, it's like you better be vigilant about asking, how is that taking place in our current context at any given moment? Is that accurate?
Yes, even a step further, though. What I'm saying is that the
please
vehicle,
go as far
right,
as you want, Nick.
that the vehicle of Christian practice and theology is always susceptible, that there is no immunity, that there is no vaccine, that there is no point at which we are outside of all of the realities of fraught human interactions and violences, which again, in even the witness that we have in the sacred text is that half of the Pauline letters are warnings against folk who will come in and what Paul would say, teach a different gospel, or those who write under Paul's name, right? So Paul's, issue that he writes about to the Galatians church is, how dare you let Judaizers, right? These are these folks who have a certain commitment to their Jewish ancestry and practice and what that should mean for the liturgical and theological orientation of the church, and particularly around circumcision. And yes. Paul is like, if you all let these folks come in here and convince you that you need to be circumcised in order to follow Jesus well, then you've made the cross of no effect to you. This is already recognizing that the issues are not resolved. And that, within 30, 40 years of what was the start of the movement, they're already contending with how do we define these boundaries? And how do we determine what is good, what's bad, what's in, what's out? That we're not outside even the realities of the garden, the knowledge of good and evil, and who gets to arbitrate that and what are the consequences thereof. So it's not just that, that we have to be vigilant about, what perverts the faith, but that the faith's Achilles heel is its propensity to perversion at any and every turn.
Okay.
And what that means is that every break off, right? So when this church breaks from this church and these people leave this church, that in that break, they're already positioning themselves to become what they left.
Yeah, and they're trying to get away from something, right? That's dangerous. That's
right. One of the ways that I talk about this with my students is that you can never make it such that your parents are not your parents, that you are always an offspring of something. And you just have to, we wrestle with that, but we would really like to think that our versions are somehow less fraught.
Less fraught.
Right. Less complicated, less egregious than those that have come before. And I don't know that we are ever in that position, which then again, for me, the gift then of faith is the possibility of mercy, the possibility of forgiveness. And because I'm a good Methodist, the possibility of grace.
All those being given, communicated to us, delivered to us by God, and how we share that amongst one another. Why do you sound so pessimistic? And I'm just going to go ahead and show our cards. This is a question that Nick presented to me that he wanted me to ask him. Why do you sound so pessimistic? What is your hope for humanity? So you can hear what I'm assuming there is you hear yourself sounding pessimistic or being pessimistic. If I get any of this wrong, tell me. And you imagine that when people listen to you, that somehow they hear a deep strain of pessimism. So if those things are accurate, what is your hope for humanity?
Yes. So that question is a question that probably more readily comes from my students.
Okay.
Because much of what I want in my students is for them to not have lazy theology. That if you are going to do work in the church, if you are going to be a faith leader of any stripe, then the real heft in theology is not just how well you can articulate and memorize the questions that have become before, but how much you really think about the questions that are animating the decisions that are happening right now, the practices that are emerging right now. And so in that, I do my best, right? This is the privilege of a classroom in many respects, is to just not let my students off the hook, right? That your theology has something at stake. And, how well you wrestle with that matters. And that you wrestle with it matters. And so as I'm pushing, right, students are hearing like, oh my gosh, like this is just so hopeless. And my own sense of conviction is I cannot claim a worthwhile faith if it requires me to bracket the realities that are death dealing at every turn. If I cannot see that people are experiencing hell, that my brothers and sisters in parts of our own country, my siblings in other parts of the world, be that Palestine, be that South Sudan, be that the Democratic Republic of the Congo, be that Haiti, be that the Batays in Dominican Republic. If I cannot conceive of their experience as hell, then whatever I'm offering as good news is really not good news. So the gospel requires me, my read is that the gospel requires me to not discount the extent and the ways humans seek to perfect violence under any banner, God banner, state banner, personal banner, capitalist banner. If I'm not willing to at least reckon with that, then whatever I'm preaching, whatever I'm trying to get folks to believe, it's just a decorated form of idolatry. So for me, imprecation, right, the imprecatory psalms, these apocalyptic vision, a notion of the eschaton, the way my enslaved ancestors sang about heaven, for me, these become resources to suggest that whatever our hope is, it's not this. And that our best practices, right, the staying back in Galatians, the fruit of the Spirit, against which there is no such law.
Yeah.
there's a Lutheran component in this, right? There's a total depravity, which the reality of the total depravity is that it renders grace the most agentic force in any iteration of salvation. So I think that that's sort of where I fall in terms of the hope, is that we need a God, or we need God talk that doesn't force us to see the gardens without recognizing the graveyards.
So this shows up in just about every one of your sermons somehow when you preach. The undercurrent, kind of the river that runs through it, is both. And if none of these words work, say that doesn't work, Doug. Praise, joy, whatever, and lament. I mean, these things, and grieving, and
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reality of existence itself is that those two realities are in a dance where sometimes you can't tell who's leading and who's following. Childbirth is painful and deadly,
yes.
Even as it is the possibility for new life.
Yeah.
My garden and its flourishing is predicated on the effectiveness of decomposition. And my own body requires me to eat things that were living and to metabolize them for my own sustenance. So we are never outside of life and death. I mean, what we are trying to do is that we want life at no cost. We want beauty to be an eternal, isolated reality. And for whatever reason, we're hardwired for those kinds of pleasures.
Why are we hardwired that way? It seems like it's in direct opposition to what you're saying to live into. It's like we're hardwired for one way, but we're to live in to another way. It could be.
It is. I mean, I think it's because we really do believe that humans are special. I think that's the fundamental piece, is that we have a sense that.
But aren't they though, Nick? I don't mean special up against anything else, but
that's the only way we can be special, is that it has to be up against something else, right? That's specialness is a notion of distinction. So you got to be distinct from something.
Well, that's a good point.
I mean, and that's the heart and soul of even how our text opens up the story, is that God is doing all of this creating, and then all of a sudden God says, I want to make something just like myself. And ta-da, just happens to be us. It's not the orca, right? It's not the, it's not the Venus flytrap. It's these, flesh sacks.
These human things.
These human things. And I think because that's a fundamental commitment, right? We've evolved these practices and technologies that keep centering that for us.
There we go. Right. Would you say a little bit more about the technologies? Because, of course, most of us think about that in regards to my cell phone and my computer and those technologies and my war with Verizon and trying to figure all that out. Would you say?
Right. So when I'm talking about technologies, I'm really talking about the practices and the materials that we augment in order for us to either do something that we understand to be more efficiently and or to make meaning, right? So technologies, earliest technologies would be tools, right? I can pick one piece of fruit with my hand, but if I get a rope, I make a rope and I tie it around the base of this tree, I could just shake this and I can get, 20 pieces of fruit.
Okay.
In the time that it would have taken me to climb and get 4 of them. That becomes a technology. Obviously, one of the most primal technologies is language. And some of what I think where humans get to be a little bit different, to my knowledge at least, is that we are very presumptive that our technologies are the most sophisticated and hallowed.
Special.
And that's in large part because we don't understand.
Right.
We really don't understand very well how blue whales communicate and how deep water sea animals are able to retain every experience that they've had of their pod over their entire lifetime and then transfer that to another generation. So all the knowledge, we just don't have capacity because we don't know how to communicate. Like that's not a technology that we have access to. We don't understand how the tree's roots can, we scientifically can talk about, the processes that we've named, but we understand those external to our own experience in the same way that our breathing and our blinking are external to our own conscious experience. Like I'm not consciously thinking, okay, red blood cells move throughout all portions of my body to make sure that oxygen is right. So our parasympathetic nervous system is already, doing so much work that it doesn't require the cognitive portions of our brain to be actively engaged until there's injury. And then we recognize like, oh wow, I do have to think about my breathing.
Good point. Very good
Now, I
point.
do have to think about how I swallow.
Have to be conscious.
I have to be conscious of it. Um, so, yeah, I mean, I think so. Right. Again, when I'm talking about technology, I'm really
That
talking
helps,
about
Nick. Thank you.
all of these ways that we construct our experience of the world and how we navigate it. Religion is that technology. Right. Obviously, these tools that we use are technologies.
Is the Bible itself, the Bible that I hold, that it's a Pew Bible, is that a conglomerate of technology?
It is. And it is a technology that I think persists because of how well it adapts to power.
Goodness. But it also
It
does, it also, a lot of its own, the voice of the Bible, at least one of the voices of the Bible, is to challenge power and to be suspicious of power and to speak truth to power. But
Mhm.
also, the Bible, isn't it true? I'm not a theologian, but isn't it true that the Bible also tells on itself? It's like, wow, there's a lot of corrupt power going on in this book.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I think it's Mmembe, I can't always pronounce his name, whose skepticism is a very kind way to put it. Disdain may be a little bit more accurate, but I think he would actually take it a step further. Sort of his disdain for the Abrahamic traditions has to do with the way monotheism in particular is expedient for political power.
Mm,
What we understand in the modern world is political
mm,
power. And there's a way that the genealogy of global conflict is really predicated on the interactions between the Abrahamic traditions. So Judaism, Islam, and
mm.
Christianity. In polytheistic contexts where there is even what may be perceived as a divine balance, right? That there are these forces that are, a lot of it just can be resolved in monotheism because there's just one God.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And everything else is subordinate, right? This is not to say that other traditions don't have a supreme being, but that supreme being is not accessible in the ways that,
Mm.
particularly within Christianity, God becomes accessible. So I think as a technology, like a stone that can be sharpened, the biblical text, the faiths that emerge from various iterations of that text are really, really good stones that can be sharpened.
Can you imagine somebody listening to you and I talking, and they're listening to you, and they say, and he teaches at a Christian seminary?
Yeah.
And, and, and he's a Christian pastor? He goes to a Christian church? Gosh, Nick, I want to have part two with you. Let's close out this way. If I heard it correctly, when you first, as a 14-year-old, you heard the call, and then when the female preacher, was it Dr. Watts or
Dr. Webb.
Dr. Webb, when she said it's time to go back, it's time to go to school, and you shared with your youth worker, you said the youth worker looked, or you looked over at the youth worker, and there was a connection there of meeting eyes, like, ooh, this is for you, Nick. You said that she said it, and the inflection of her voice sounded like what you heard inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
Did I hear that
Mm-hmm.
correctly?
Mm-hmm.
Would a misuse of interpretive technology be that, so that's the way the Spirit always sounds? I mean, so we can build on that now. So you say that the Spirit's spoken to you. Well, you're going to need to hear it from the preacher in the same inflection of voice, and then we'll know it's true. Is that another? I mean, structure is important, but when you presented earlier about women dancing, men singing, children playing, I was playing in my mind off of the detriment of structure, and that because you seem to be presenting, if I heard you correctly, this wasn't just the black church in the past, but the current church is to be a church that practices those kind of things. And so it's playing off of form and structure, which can be oppressive. That stuff in some people's minds gets dangerous. Like, well, goodness, I mean, if you let go of control, man,
Mm-hmm.
that can go. And then they'll find a verse to challenge. Well, we need structure and we need whatever. I know I'm going all over the place. I want to go back to, then you heard, that was at 14. And then at 19, you're playing the organ, and the preacher addresses you as you're hiding and it's time to come out. Do you mind me asking how old you are now, Nick?
I'm 45.
When you do you ever, I don't know, I don't know. I guess there's no question it's inappropriate, but you can shoot it down quickly if you'd like. It's the question that keeps coming to me. Do you wish sometimes that you had never heard that within yourself, and you had never heard the preacher say, and you had never been at the organ? Do you sometimes imagine a life outside of what you've been called to be?
Don't.
Wow.
I think that the paradox of
Wow.
faith, and this is the witness that I've
Yeah,
inherited.
talk to me, Nick.
The witness that I've inherited. My grandmother sings a song,
Mm.
"This joy I have, the world didn't give it and the world can't take it away." My experiences are a gift to help me believe beyond what my eyes see and what my own body may feel. And the reality is that it's just never not messy. And there is no, right? So on these poles of high structure, high formality, and improvisation and self empowerment, neither one of those are the solution. And the Spirit can show up in either, when I went from the Pentecostal church to the AME church, the AME church's primary liturgy is 18th century adaptation of John Wesley's read of Thomas Cranmer's prayer book. And so you have all of these Black folks every single Sunday who are praying prayers that Thomas Cranmer wrote and John Wesley just Americanized, right, in some of the English forms. And for me, that was the first time I was ever in a church that had a written liturgy, right? Because in my conscience, was like, we follow the Spirit. And I just remember reading these words and being, pricked to the heart and all of this. And I was like, oh, wow. Like, I didn't know that, like, a prayer that somebody wrote 500 years ago, 300 years ago could be impactful in the way it is today. Now, that doesn't then abdicate all of the other realities of the expansion of the Church of England and its various theologies thereof. So, again, it's hard to say that we really value roses when we don't value thorns, or that we really love healthy gardens if we can't figure out the fact that, like, no, it takes some cow dung and some nitrogen produced by worms and dirt to help these things to flourish. So what I'm trying to suggest is that I don't know that good faith requires us to have certain forms of denial. I think what it actually requires us to do is to have a joy that just refuses to be predicated on any one thing as the thing. And we still fail at that. So some of what that means, but what that means is that there has to be a certain kind of humility, that we move through. One of the things that I tell my students in class is that I can't afford to despise ignorance, because ignorance is the mother of learning, right? Ignorance is the parent to knowledge. And if we value knowledge, we have to value the unknown, and we have to value what it means to not know. And so what we want to do in the class is that we want to make it okay to not know and to learn.
Man,
but in our learning to also learn that there's other things that we don't know.
Yeah, that's huge, though, in the learning process.
Right. So, but if our learning is just helping us to be more secure, I am more insecure now about what I can declaratively say theologically with the PhD than I was before it. Before it, I could be like, this is what the Bible says, this is what it means.
Yeah.
Now I can say, well, in this present moment, this is how I exegete this text. But if you look at the sermon I wrote from this same lectionary text 6 years ago, there's a different perspective at work.
Where can we folk that don't go to your church and don't have access to your network, where can we go hear you preach a sermon that you've already preached? This is the way we're going to close out today, because I want you to point us to that, because I want to go hear you preach.
I've recently preached at Eastern Star Church here in Indianapolis.
Will we find that on their website?
Yes, you can find it on their website or their YouTube, as well as Mount Carmel Church here in Indianapolis. My home church is Bethel Cathedral, AME, and I regularly preach there.
Okay.
So those are places.
Do you have one sermon in particular that comes to your mind, that if a person said, I only have time to hear Nick once, and I'll go to those different websites, but hey, give me a little navigation here? Do you have one that you would point us to?
Yes, there's a sermon that I recently preached, and I can't tell you the exact Sunday, but it's within the last 2 months at Bethel Cathedral, AME here in Indianapolis. And the sermon title is called Check Your Soil. And it's based off of Hosea, the first chapter, where God tells Hosea to go marry a prostitute.
Well, let's see. This is how I get away with swearing. I'll say, because I've got an agricultural background, so I'll say, well, on the farm, even though my family was not a farming family, but I did work on the farm, and I've worked on farms and ranches. On the farm, we would say, it sounds to me like that sermon might just kick my ass. That's what it sounds like to me. I'm going to go listen to that sermon, and then you and I are going to keep talking. Nick, would you come back to From the Belly?
I sure will.
I would love to have you join a roundtable. There's a few people popping in my head that I would love to get you in conversation with. I've had people say, hey, get people, I'm going to mention this to you when we were talking in the Zoom call, get people on there that'll disagree with a former guest or whatever and have them debate and whatever. My thoughts, I have no interest in that. I mean, people can have, of course, different viewpoints, and we would want that at the round table is what I call it. But I'm sure not interested in, okay, this person on this side of the aisle argue with this. Recently on Facebook, which I sometimes wonder while I'm still on it. But hey, what I can say is that's how I met you, Nick. That's how I met you. You showed up and I went, let me check this guy out. Yeah, man, I want to talk to that guy. That's how I met him. It's how I've been meeting all the guests that I've got lined up. But what I've recently done is people that show up on my page and just continue to pester and call me out and whatever, I wrestled with that and thought, no, leave them there and I need to answer to them. And recently I'm just like, you're out of here. I have no interest in, you're never going to support anything that I say. I guess you would have value, and maybe I'm just trying to make my world sanitized where I don't have to argue with people. But I just kicked somebody off yesterday and just went, I'm just not interested in hearing what you have to say. So, anyways, that's me ranting. Nick, this has been a blessing, man. We didn't get to the question about arts and culture, which I'm fascinated to talk to you about, but I'll be in touch, and I think people are really going to enjoy going to hear you preach now that they've heard you speak today. Anything you want to close us out on, or is it time to?
No, I appreciate this space that you've made through this podcast and your interest in convening conversations that may not happen otherwise across this expansive network. So I do want to commend
Oh, thank you.
the commitment and conviction that it takes to sort of function in this liminal space where we are oftentimes more interested in resolutions than we are in real engagement. So I appreciate this space
You
to
bet, Nick. Man, it's
engage.
my honor. Thank you for investing
Yeah.
your time. I know it's well beyond lunch, so talking to you makes me homesick for the Midwest, makes me homesick for where I'm from. But hey, I really loved your answer about that you don't regret or think about some other life. What I really picked up from that is what I heard you saying in a nutshell is this is the life that I'm to live. My
Mhm.
history is the life that I'm to live and the current life I have. But I also know there's other people who would say, man, my life is full of thorns, man. I mean, we all have thorns, but so I really just appreciate what you presented today. Bless you, Nick. Thank you, man. And hang with me
Thank you,
here
Doug.
while this thing, I shut it off and we'll see if it uploads. So
Sounds
thank
good.
you, man. Bless you.